Thanks, Owen. That's CGTN's Owen Fairclough reporting there. Well, let's go to our panel right now. Joining us from Babylon, New York, Chris Hahn is the host of the Aggressive Progressive podcast and the syndicated Chris Hahn radio show. Michael Johns is in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He's a conservative commentator, writer, and political analyst. With us from New York, Erin Mattei is host of Pushback with Erin Mattei on the Gray Zone. And also joining us from New York, Vinoo Varghese is founder and principal attorney at Varghese and Associates, a criminal defense law firm. Welcome to all of you. Chris Hahn, let me start with you. I want to get to the impeachment in a moment, but let's talk about an event today in the Oval Office held by President Biden. He signed more executive orders. These were to combat what he called systemic racism and advance race equity. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
I believe this nation and this government need to change their whole approach to the issue of racial equity. Yes, we need criminal justice reform, but that isn't nearly enough. We need to open the promise of America to every American, and that means we need to make the issue of racial equity not just an issue for any one department of government. It has to be the business of the whole of government.
So, Chris, lots of fine words there, but do these executive actions really have any teeth? I mean, is this more symbolic than anything of substance?
Well, it has teeth within the federal government. As you might recall, Donald Trump canceled racial justice training for federal government workers. So now President Biden is actually making that mandatory once again. So yeah, it does have teeth. The federal government employs millions of people, spends trillions of dollars. So those dollars will be put to use with companies that are willing to abide by what these executive orders state. So yeah, they have a lot of teeth. Look, they're not sustainable past the term of a president. The next president can just undo them, as Joe Biden's undoing much of what Donald Trump did by executive order. But it is a good place to start, and hopefully Congress will come along and pass similar reforms. Yeah,
I was wondering, Chris, because I can understand the improvements that could take place in the bureaucracy, but racism is an attitude, isn't it? A president can't change that, can he?
Well, I mean, leadership starts at the top. The president can show by his acts and his deeds what America should stand for. Unfortunately, we just had a president that didn't want to pay any attention to that. Right. So having a president in Joe Biden who wants to kind of go forward and move forward towards a more perfect union and fix some of these racial problems that have plagued this nation for so many years, and not just the last 4 years, but for the last 240 years of our republic. I think it's very important to have a president speaking these words and acting on them any way he can.
Erin, I want to stay with this subject for a moment. Joe Biden has quite a history when it goes back to race relations. In fact, I was reading a report in the New York Times, which was written in June of 2019, in which it said that Biden had worked with segregationist senators in the 80s and 90s to overhaul criminal justice laws. And he was very proud of that, of the effort he made there. And according to criminal justice experts whom are cited in this Times report, they say his role in criminal justice legislation laid the groundwork for mass incarceration, which, as we know, have devastated black communities. Will what he announced today be enough to correct what happened in the past?
No, of course not. There's a lot of work to be done. I mean, we're talking about a country that is built on slavery, and until that is addressed, and until the redlining of, where you have systemic discrimination against black people to prevent them from owning homes, until stuff like that is seriously addressed, then no way. And look, when it comes to Biden, there's no better authority than his own vice president, Kamala Harris, who criticized him during the primary for working with segregationists and, of course, authoring that crime bill. So whatever Biden does, it will not have the impact that it needs to have. And, of course, I question his choice of personnel. He had Susan Rice helping him roll this out today. Well, Susan Rice, by advocating the war on Libya, helped bring slave markets to Libya. And of course, not only does wars like that decimate countries like Libya, but also it takes away much needed resources at home to deal with things like systemic racism. So I think anything is an improvement over Donald Trump, but I don't have much faith in Joe Biden and the people around him.
Michael Johns, there was one other development in that event at the White House today. Biden did say that he's going to be asking federal agencies, not asking, he signed an order that will compel federal agencies to stop renewing contracts with private prison corporations, and he will also propose legislation to extend the Voting Rights Act. Is he going to get Republican support for these measures?
Well, I think he's off to a bad start on this unity effort, and he's not honing in on the issues where I think there is an established opportunity for bipartisan initiatives. You know, on the issue of these private prisons, they've been controversial, and I think he was once a champion of it. His views on this have emerged. He's also not been the biggest champion of racial sensitivity. If that's now the biggest issue that I think is confronting Democrats internally, you probably wouldn't have selected a candidate who had given a eulogy for a KKK member in Robert Byrd and a whole long history of other issues. But I think instead he's got to be honing in on issues of job creation, getting through this pandemic, working with Republicans, and he should be speaking out on the impeachment. There's no basis for it. It's clearly not going anywhere. I think he'd make some good measure in coming out and saying, let's not waste any time on this.
Michael, let me ask you that again then. I'll get to impeachment in a moment, but on this issue of private prisons and expanding the Voting Rights Act, are you saying Republicans are not going to be on board with that?
Well, I don't really see that there is going to be a broad interest in working on those two issues. Of course, the revisions on the Voting Rights Act are going to all be in, what the details are. So there's no blanket opposition on that issue. Private prisons have, in the minds of some, reduced some of the cost of administration and been efficient in some areas, and they've been unsuccessful in some other areas. So
right.
It's sort of a mix. It's a hybrid of approaches, and I think we all sort of center in on the fact that we have too many people in jail, period. And Biden and Obama didn't do much about that when they were in. I hope he will now in addressing some of these early release programs and getting nonviolent incarcerated individuals out.
Okay, I'm going to turn now to the impending trial of former President Donald Trump in the United States Senate. I'm going to bring in Vinoo Varghese for this part of the show. Vinoo, senators were sworn in today for the trial. They're effectively the jurors in this trial. The question is it legal or does it violate the Constitution? We heard from the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, earlier. This is what he had to say. Let's listen.
The theory that the impeachment of a former official is unconstitutional is flat out wrong by every frame of analysis: constitutional context, historical practice, precedent, and basic common sense.
So, Vinoo, what are your thoughts on that? Is it constitutional?
I believe it is. I mean, you have precedent for it. You have the Secretary of War under President Grant, who was charged after he left office, or he was impeached. He wasn't convicted. I think Chuck Schumer, Senator Schumer, engages in hyperbole a lot. And I don't think it's so clear an issue. I think you have precedent for it. And in this particular case, it comes down to a question, right? This is a political process. So this isn't a criminal process. These are what basically Alexander Hamilton, called the impeachment process a place to fix an abuse of public trust. And everything President Trump did along the way that led to the riots or the invasion of the Capitol was a violation of public trust. But, the larger question is this the right thing? And that's a political question, but this is a political process. But ultimately, history will judge this as to whether the king is dead or alive. I mean, Trump survived one impeachment. If he survives this, what's to prevent him from running again? And I think that's the larger question for the Democrats. But I think they've hitched they know what get the train running, and we'll see what happens.
Right, just to clarify something, I mean, the penalty for this kind of offense, as you point out, it is political, but the penalty is removal from office. But the president has already left office. Right, but they can vote afterwards to permanently bar him. Right. So that's a separate vote. And they will not need 67 senators. If they get to 67 senators for impeachment, then they can bar him for good after that. But they won't need a supermajority on that because they've already got the impeachment. So I think that's the thing that makes this an interesting process. All right, Michael Johns, do you think that's the intention of Democrats here, to prevent Donald Trump from holding office ever again?
100%. It's designed to go after Trump with one final stab to prevent him from being in the public domain or a candidate again. It's also designed to stigmatize the tens of millions of Americans who supported him. We cannot be punishing political leaders for political speech. And in this particular case, I would tread very lightly on two fronts. Number one, the correlation between violent or supportive rhetoric for the street riots associated with the Minneapolis police killing are much better established than anything Trump said in that speech. As widely reported, he used the word patriotic and peacefully. Patriotically and peacefully. Peacefully. I mean, end of story. Number two on this is the fact that you had these individuals engaged in this violence who had planned the event for weeks. That's demonstrably evident. That would be part of evidence that would be admitted as part of the Senate trial. If this were an actual criminal trial, you'd have a summary judgment dismissal on this particular case. And then, the other issue is that the president, when you really think about what he's been up to since Election Day, has been searching around between courts and state legislatures to get a venue for his allegation that in 6 states there was substantial voter fraud that could have had a substantial impact on the electoral outcome.
Yeah.
If the allegation is that in so saying this, he inflamed a certain number of dozens or hundreds of people to take those acts, then the very question of whether or not the election was fraudulent would actually provide him with that opportunity to put on evidence. And in the Navarro report and the Texas AG report and in a whole bunch of other information of 5,000 signed affidavits, there is the evidence. So it's almost strategically a question whether you should welcome it.
Yeah, I know Chris Hahn wants to respond to that. Go ahead, Chris.
I mean, all that stuff is nonsense. The Texas AG.
How many of the 5,000 affidavits did you read, Chris? How many of the 5,000?
Okay, let Chris finish.
I have read many of those 5,000 affidavits. I am an attorney. At least 100 of them, and they're all. And by the way, none of the ones that I read. And I'm going to talk now. You just lied for whatever minutes you were on. Now I'll talk.
All right.
Of the 100 I read, not a single one was an eyewitness account. All of it was secondhand. I heard from somebody who heard from somebody. The reason why these cases were thrown out of court, because unlike when you're giving a speech to a rally of people who love you, the reason why they were thrown out of court is unlike when you give a rally or you give a speech on TV, they were thrown out of courts. 60 times.
Just a moment, Michael.
Okay.
Big difference.
60 times they were thrown out of court because there was no evidence.
By courts.
You need evidence. They were actually many of them were heard by courts, and even when the Supreme Court ruled, and there were 2 justices that dissented on the standing issue, they said they would grant no other relief on the merits. So we know that this was meritless, and many judges appointed by Donald Trump said this is meritless. You need facts to bring a case. You can't just make something up out of
so you have nothing to fear then.
Your big
you should welcome the trial.
All right, one moment.
One moment. The evidence.
Chris, Michael, one moment.
There were 60 opportunities to have a trial.
All right.
No, we might have one now, though, in the impeachment trial.
All right, let me bring the lawyer into this conversation. Vinoo, what do you make of this? I mean, I thought this had already been litigated, these allegations that there was impropriety in the elections. Joe Biden has already been sworn in as president.
Yeah, I have to agree with much of what my colleague said. It was arguing against this. I mean, he lost 59 out of 60 court battles, and including a blistering opinion in the Third Circuit, basically eviscerating any claim that he had that there was any voter fraud. So this is just more of the same. But let's bring this back to the impeachment issue of what speech.
Right.
I mean, let's take a look at what he did. Look at him pressuring this is including the articles of impeachment, pressuring the Georgia Secretary of State to find those 11,000, whatever number of votes it was, and then going from there to make public comments against Mike Pence, saying basically he's got to do the right thing or he's going to be held accountable. I mean, January 6th was a procedural day. It was not meant for a substantive argument or debate. So the question, I think, when you look at this, right, and this is a quasi-criminal standard, is, hey, was it foreseeable that this was going to happen? Yeah. Right. Did he say storm the Capitol? No, he didn't. However, when you take all these actions together and all his tweets, right, it's one thing to make lawsuits, and he kept losing, right? He lost Actually, that 60th lawsuit was, I mean, it was, you want to call it a victory. All he was allowed to do was have his poll watchers get a little closer to where it was being counted. So it wasn't anything of any substance.
Right.
So when you look at this, he kept losing, and then he just turned something into something else, and then that became what led to the storming of the Capitol. So in that sense, he should be held accountable.
All right, let me go back to Aaron Mate. Aaron, at least we forget, what Donald Trump did and said on the afternoon of January 6th was roundly condemned by both Democrats and Republicans. Joe Biden has talked about unity as well, and I was wondering, is there any other way to deal with this? There was one suggestion from Greta Van Susteren, who's a former CNN, Fox, and MSNBC commentator, and she proposed a bipartisan censure. Is that going to work? Because as Michael John said earlier on, as well as Vinoo, that the intention here on the part of the Democrats is to prevent Trump from running ever again.
I think censure would probably attract more bipartisan support because I do think that it's pretty clear that what Trump did was unhinged and reckless. Whether you can hold him criminally responsible for the mob attack, I'm not sure because political speech is protected. And also, there was the fact that the intelligence agencies and law enforcement had a massive failure. And there are some people who think that that was the product of a conspiracy involving the Trump White House. I don't think so. I think that was just a complete breakdown of security. And what I'm worried about with the Trump impeachment is whether the focus on Trump will let national security officials, for example, this massive Department of Homeland Security that we have, whether that will help them evade scrutiny. Then there's also the fact that, look, it's true that Trump was reckless, but Democrats in their own way rejected his victory in 2016. They officially accepted the results, but then they proceeded to accuse Trump of being a Russian agent and basically weaponize the intelligence agencies to help prove that to be true, when of course it wasn't. So I think both sides have some reckoning to do here. Perhaps you have a strong case that Trump is guilty of an impeachable offense, but to go ahead with that, we at least shouldn't overlook the consequences, including the fact that it overlooks Democrats' own role in refusing to accept 2016, and also the fact that, again, you have a massive screw-up here from law enforcement.
Right. Can we draw any equivalency, Aaron, between those two things, the allegations that Trump had colluded with Russia and what we saw on January 6th, which was really a violent storming of the Capitol building?
Well, they're not equivalent because, yes, the MAGA mob was violent and it was racist and it was hateful. But the Russiagate thing also involved a lot of fraud on the part of the intelligence officials who carried it out. They withheld exculpatory information from the FISA court. They leaked false information to the media that Trump and his associates were in cahoots with Russia. And all of this fueled a climate where Democrats, from Hillary Clinton on down, were calling Trump an illegitimate president. And I think that has at least some role in the background to all the inflamed tensions that we saw on January 6th. I do, and I think Democrats have to reckon with that to be able to approach this issue seriously.
Right. Chris Hahn, this is the second time, of course, that Donald Trump is being impeached in Congress. Is there a risk here that impeachment could be used as a tool, as a cudgel, really, that will be used by whichever party is in power to attack the other one that's sitting in the White House?
I mean, I think if attempting to overthrow or overturn the will of the people in a fair election isn't impeachable, I don't know what else is. I get the talk that there could be some risk that this becomes too political and we have more impeachments, but this is something that deserves to have a consequence. And this is the consequence the Constitution gives us. And disqualifying Donald Trump from office would be the ultimate consequence for him right now. It would take away his ability to grift from the 72 million people who voted for him, which he wants to do badly right now, and he can't do it through Twitter and other social media platforms. So he wants an opportunity to have those people giving him money for something. And if the Congress takes away his ability to run for office again, well, that severely limits his ability to steal from his supporters, who he has been lying to since day one, and particularly for the past 11 weeks.
Michael Johns, it seems that the Republican Party is divided over this impeachment trial. Some want a conviction so the party can move on from the Trump era. Others, of course, remain very loyal to the president. In fact, CNN put it this way. It says the GOP is at war with itself. And of course, we shouldn't forget that 74 million voters voted for Trump. Are these divisions going to hurt the party?
Yeah, I think both parties are in a state of kind of reconstruction. And so, over the last 4 years, there's been a lot of times when various Republican officials have come out and had issues with something Trump said or did or policy positions, and that was, taken as being, hey, he's being rejected by his own kind. But you got to go back and remember in 2016 that he came into office running really against the Republican establishment. And some of these individuals, a handful that might line up to actually vote against him in the Senate, are people he's more or less been at war with over the last 4 years. He has the upper hand in the Republican Party. The Make America Great Again agenda is here to stay. It's a winning political one. It's been largely beneficial for the country. He proved in the first 3 years that it's workable, and I think he's going to continue to be a major force. As far as the removal goes in the impeachment, it is going nowhere, period. Not maybe, period. Not only are they not going to get 67, they're not going to get 60 or even 55 votes. So I think you got to really recalculate the position on that at this point.
Right, Vinoo, let me get your thoughts on that. We've just got about a minute left. As Michael John says, this may not go anywhere. There's not the votes there for it, but the country is deeply divided right now. It's polarized. Will this process deepen those divisions?
I don't think so. I think the fact that he's not in office is the real issue. You don't hear about him the way that you did. He doesn't dominate the news cycle. But the danger to the Democrats is that they bring him back into the news cycle. And a victory for Trump here will only embolden him. I do not believe, I still hold out maybe a faint hope that these senators that these senators will do the right thing. I think impeachment, that they should vote to convict. And then vote to remove him from office. I think that will do a lot of good for the country and save the Republican Party so they can move forward. I mean, this is what's really at stake here.
Chris Hahn, very quickly, I only got 30 seconds. I want to ask you this question that I asked our reporter earlier on, and that is, Democrats have all the power right now. Why are they power sharing?
Well, I worked for Chuck Schumer, and I worked in the Senate when there was a 50-50 split. You have to operate the Senate. You have to rule on who has the committees. 50-50 in the Senate, where you usually need 60 votes to pass things, is really not a majority. It is a majority in name only.
Right.
They could get things passed with 51, but they got to operate day to day, so it's going to need cooperation.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.